Okay, so last week, I'm teaching away, and all of a sudden, an image pops into my head from my friend's manger scene. And I described it last week. I didn't describe it all, but I'll do a quick recap. So Joseph is there, and he's doing a selfie, and Mary is next to the manger, and she's holding a Starbucks cup. She's got like one exposed shoulder, and she's making like kiss lips, for the gram, for the Instagram. And the wise men are there, and they're on Segways, and they're carrying Amazon packages. And the shepherd, there's one shepherd there, and he has on headphones and is looking at his iPhone. So, and I said, that popped into my head, and I mentioned it, and I said, next week, I should do a Christmas sermon. And some of you laughed, and I thought, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So, let's do a Christmas sermon. And why not? Because look at you. You all want it. I even see Star Wars is representing, Christmas Star Wars, yep, rocking the Force. So what is going on culturally? I passed my neighbor's house. Well, I actually have a neighbor that's here, so it's not his house. And they had 3 light-up nativity scenes on the lawn, 3 separate ones. I thought, that seems excessive. But actually part of me was really wondering in a deeper sense, why? Why are we still talking about this? What's going on? And our culture is a strange mixture of things. Go to the mall. It is absolutely insane. It's like a competition of music now, because there's music in the hallway and there's music in each store, and then there's music at the kiosks, and it's like the whole thing is just going ringing like this, and talk about light. It's like a light explosion, just radiating a kind of cultural chaos. And then we have all these stories that we're drawn to and sometimes drawn away from. And there's something about this time of year. After all, it's the solstice. It's the winter solstice. And it's the darkest time of year, and we know this. We know that on one level, all religious festivals and feasts and rituals are connected to the earth. You don't even have to look that hard. Why are we doing it this time of year? It's not because Jesus was born on December 25th. It's not. It's because it's the darkest time of the year. That's why we're doing it. And that's why there's this tension between light and dark, and a kind of anxiety that comes with this. We live in a culture that's very uncomfortable with darkness. I mean, we don't even like to many of us go to sleep watching screens, And I'm not criticizing anyone other than myself. Like, we don't like darkness very much. And there's something that just in this time of year is dancing around that sort of tension. And especially here where we live, where not only is it dark, it's really dark. And like when the sun was shining yesterday, I was like, oh my God, this is a miracle, I do believe. So there's this dance. And of course, one of the things that I guess maybe it's just the line that I'm finding myself walking on. I don't even know if I chose it. It's just like, it chose me. I'm interested in the conversation and the relationship between the past and our meaning-making systems and our symbols and our spirituality and our religions and our archetypes and the present. There's a kind of conversation that's happening. And we see it in its cheap manifestations now with light-up manger scenes. That's a conversation between the past and meaning and truth and light and our present reality in the 21st century. That's the line I'd like to keep walking. And it's like once a year, here it comes around again. I was remembering that for a few years when I was teaching high school, I would get invited to speak. I'd either get invited to speak at Mars Hill or various other churches. And I started noticing over time that I was always getting invited during the holidays. And I thought, that's interesting. Like, why don't you come and give the Christmas sermon? Really? Or come and do Easter? Which is strange. You'd think, this is an easy home run, Just light some candles and sing Silent Night and say, Jesus was born in a manger. Everyone will go, oh. But there even anxiety among pastors. Like, I don't know what to do with this time of year. Because we know in the most basic sense, we can feel the tension between a poor person being born in a stable and the mall. Right? We don't even have to, it's not even a stretch. Everybody feels that. Everybody feels that, the weirdness of it. And I was thinking this week even about the manger scene, like, okay, so we have our presents and all of our stuff that comes from China, otherwise known as presents. And I'm not against presents, I love them myself. And then we put little Jesus up there in the corner, like to sanction the whole event, like as he's like absolving us, Like if he were just suddenly come alive, what would Jesus say? Like, hey, what are you guys doing? We know that. It's like everybody knows that. Whether they're religious or not, we can feel the tension between those things. And between power and powerlessness, and between light and dark. And actually, I think, even though our culture is very strange right now, and like James Hollis, I put that quote in there last week, we have to sift through the magnificent ruins of our religion and our symbols and our meaning making. Sift through them. We feel the magnificent ruins. I think it's an opportunity. And instead of looking away from all the madness, I'd like to look at the madness. I'd like to look at the story, bits and pieces of it, and just ask the questions. What is this bringing up? What the heck is going on? So first, a poem from Rilke, in case I haven't mentioned Rilke in a while. Okay, here's a poem. You, darkness, of whom I am born. You, darkness, of whom I am born. I love you more than the light. I love you more than the light. I love you more than the flame that limits the world. To the circle that illuminates and excludes all the rest, like the way a campfire does. But the dark embraces everything. The dark embraces everything. Shapes and shadows, creatures and me, people and nations, the dark embraces everything, just as they are. It lets me imagine a great presence stirring beside me. The darkness helps me imagine a great presence stirring beside me. Here's the final line, I believe in the night. See, Advent is a season of anticipation that gets increasingly dark. And as it gets increasingly dark, traditionally, you light another candle. It's that anticipatory, and it's not you light a spotlight, all right? It's not you turn on all the lights in the house. It's not the frickin' mall. It's one light, and then you blow it out. And then you light it the next day. And then you blow it out. It's a dance. See, what Rilke says, I think so beautifully, actually expresses what I was saying before. We have a cultural aversion to darkness, to night. What he says is that you have some elbow room at night. You can move around. It embraces things. It embraces shapes and shadows and nations and creatures. And it allows for the imagination. Have you ever stood in front of the mirror with really bright fluorescent lights? How many of you are really happy with that experience? Okay? No, when you go out on a date, you turn the lights down. All right? Because it embraces something and it allows mystery to emerge. That's the story of Christmas. It happens at night. Not because you can do some sort of historical game and prove this or that. It happens at night because that's when mystery happens. It happens in that anticipatory, womb-like possibility of something coming into the world. He says, I believe in the night. I believe in anticipating what is yet to come, what is not here, what needs time to grow in order to come into the world, slipping in a quiet way, like the way night creatures move around in the dark. Have you ever tried to find an owl? You know? Where are they? You know? Moving around in their own silent way, just beyond our field of vision, and the imagination lights up. And in a way, it's a season of imagination. Like, that's actually the great thing about being around children. It's because they don't know what's in the box, you know, or they figured it out by shaking it or whatever, or going on the internet, looking at what's about to be delivered. But it's that season of unknowing, you know, of anticipation and of newness and of possibility. And like the kids singing Jingle Bells, you know, there's a kind of pregnant possibility that this season is about. And not even all of our commercialism can screw it up, you know? It's almost like in spite of all that, there's still something there. There's still something in these deeper rhythms and symbols and stories that's worth turning toward, that's worth listening to, it's worth paying attention to. By the way, Joan, I love T.S. Eliot. I've not heard him say, I am not in this world. I wrote it down. I'm not in this world, but I am of it. It's an interesting way of saying it. That's an incarnational way of viewing the world. I'm not visiting this place. I'm of it. And children are of it. And there's something very human and ordinary about the birth of Jesus coming in, slipping in the way that it slipped in terms of its ordinariness. By the way, it reminded me of another line that I often hear people say, which is not in the Bible, but they quote the Bible as saying it, be in the world, but not of it. Have you ever heard that? That's not in the Bible, okay? Don't Google it now, just believe me. Google it later, all right? It's not in there. In fact, in some ways, it's the opposite. It's be of the world, be in it and of it. You are of it. You can't help it. How many of you have slipped on ice? Anyone? All right, you're of the world, all right? Freaking hurts, all right? I fell so hard running that I was laying on the ground and I thought, when am I going to stop running? You know, like at what age do I need to stop sprinting from the car to the house? I don't know why I'm sprinting. But I was sprinting and I fell. Be in the world and of it. Okay? That's the mystery of the Incarnation, which I'll say a few more things about in a minute. But I want to say something about the Jesus story, because Kent Dobson's opinion, the 21st century is presenting a brand new opportunity when it comes to the conversation about religion, spirituality, and meaning. I think we're graduating from about 200 years of something very important, all right? And that is the grid through which religion was run thanks to the Enlightenment, all right? So for the last 200 years, we, I think importantly, have tried to look at the Bible critically, starting with the Germans. The Germans, in their own clever way, said, what if we applied the same historical critical scholarship we do to all things to the Bible? First time that has ever happened in the history of these stories ever being told. Nobody in the first century was like, yeah, well, did this happen literally? Okay? It's not even a thought in anyone's mind, believe it or not. But thanks to the Germans, they thought it up. And they said, let's do this. So what happened post-Enlightenment, this is my McDonald's drive-through history, is they applied the same standards of what makes something historically valid or reliable. And they applied it to the biblical text. which put tons of pressure on it. So they took these beloved stories and started saying things like, now wait a minute. Did Herod really try to kill all these babies in Bethlehem? Wouldn't there be a record of such a thing? It seems kind of odd there's not. They put a question mark by it. And they said things like, well, if Jesus was born during the reign of Herod, and it also says that during the reign of Caesar Augustus, Quirinius did a census. Well, let's see when that census was. Oh, the census was about 10 years after the death of Herod. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't line up historically. And anyway, this part of the world was not part of the Roman Empire during the reign of Herod. So you can't do a census in part of the empire that you don't run. And people were like, mind blown. All right? And this is only scratching the surface. And this is the stuff that I fell in love with when I went to graduate school. And some of it, I have to be honest, was a little bit of like, I'm going to get back at my Baptist past. If I'm just really honest, like, ha, ha, ha. All right? Now, here's the problem. Do you know that the same consciousness that says that story is not literal is the same consciousness that says that story is literal? It's not a shift in consciousness. It's the same thing. Rooted in, is this literal? And the only form of truth is it literal? So to say this didn't happen is really not that much different than saying it happened. Do you know what you can do at the end of a debate between it happened or it didn't happen? Nothing. Really. Because someone's just like, it happened. You're like, no, it didn't. Where do you go from there? There's nowhere to go. And I'm actually not against the criticism, because the criticism, it was needed. It actually brought all kinds of gifts to the world. We started seeing Jesus as Jewish, really for the first time in like 1900 years. People started saying, oh, he was Jewish. He wasn't the first Christian, all right? He was a Jew. And so was everybody else, at least for a while. So that was like part of the gift of this kind of pressure. But my point is, where do we go from here? And I'd like to say, in the biggest possible sense, we're being invited into a shift in consciousness. Away from the polarity of the same literalism. And that begins to crack open a different kind of door. Because symbols, which is what I was trying to say yesterday, have no bottom and have no ceiling. They point to mysterious truths beyond them. That's a symbol. It doesn't matter if it happened. Symbols don't happen. All right? They carry something. It's like the Buddhist saying, finger pointing to the moon. The moon is the mystery. The finger, the symbol, is just the thing that points beyond itself. And we limit ourselves, I'm speaking to myself, when the only conversation is, did this happen or did it not happen? That's a very specific kind of truth that we got from the Enlightenment. But it turns out all kinds of other ways of holding truth are possible. And that brings us back to, all right, then, what are the symbols? I remember one time I was with, how many of you know who John Dominic Crossan is? All right, so, I was part of this documentary, and he was on it, and so we were talking one day. I'll never forget this. We were talking in a chapel, in St. Anne's Chapel in Israel, and the cameras weren't rolling. We were just having a conversation. And we were sitting there. It was very amazing because in St. Anne's Chapel, it's Cistercian, French monks. They're the most amazing people ever. And anyway, there's no talking in the chapel, but you can light a candle. And we're sitting there by all these lit candles. And it's very dark. There's no LED lights. All right, it's just very natural. So we're sitting there, and he said, Kent, I can't really imitate his Irish accent, or if I can, it will sound too weird and will distract from the story. So he said, Kent, imagine, speaking of imagination, imagine that the stories are not historical. Just imagine the gospel stories are not historical. And what if that was your starting place? If that was your starting place, you would learn to ask more interesting questions. That's what he told me. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, take, for example, walking on water. Let's just say Jesus didn't walk on water. And he said, I can say that because people don't walk on water. That's why. But if you stop there, that's not a very interesting question. Did he or didn't he? And he said, if you assume they're not historical in the way we ordinarily think of it, you will be forced to ask the question, then why is it there and what does it mean? And the answer isn't they're trying to trick people. Like, look, he can walk on water. Do you know how many stories there are like that of gods or semi-gods or even people doing amazing things? That's not what's interesting. Same with the virgin birth. You know, Dionysius, born of a virgin. When the Christians were like, hey, great news, Jesus, born of a virgin, they'd be like, hey, cool. So was Dionysius. It's like that scene in Monty Python when they go to the French castle and they say, hey, would you like to join us in the quest for the Holy Grail? And they say, we already got one. All right? It's like that. So that's not what's special about it. All right? That's not. It's not earth-shattering from a cultural background point of view. So anyway, you limit yourself by just asking that one kind of question. And he was just encouraging me. Let that go. Then you have to ask a question about meaning. What is it really pointing to symbolically? Pointing beyond itself. And I think there are some really powerful things in this narrative that we need right now. One of them is at the very heart of Christianity, I think. I think Christianity, one of its unique and wild gifts to the world, is the notion of the Incarnation. That something of the divine and something of the human join forces. Do you hear how that elevates the very notion of being human? Like, let's just take the story in a straightforward sense. And let's say, let's role play, all right? And let's say God comes to you in a dream. He's like, hey, I got this plan. Here's the plan. I'd like to enter the human story in some kind of mysterious and interesting and revolutionary way. And you're like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. And so he said, here's my big plan. First of all, I'm going to come to a young woman who's not married, and using my holy wind, she's going to become pregnant out of wedlock. And then I'm going to have to go and tell her husband-to-be that it's okay. Don't worry about it. It was just the wind. All right? These are, by the way, what the words mean. Holy wind or set-apart wind. And then more than that, I'm going to do this in a tiny corner of the Roman Empire under some very serious oppression, like under a kind of narcissistic dictator bent on his own power and name. All right? And then, by the way, I'm going to need this young couple's help to raise this child. Because, first-time parents are always really good at what they're doing. And they're going to live in a town that nobody's heard of. Really, not even Josephus, throwing in some historical stuff, knew about Nazareth. It's that small. Or if he knew about it, he didn't record it in the list of towns that are in Galilee. That's a fun party fact you can use later. Your friends are going to be impressed. So anyway, now at the end of this, do you think, you might say, hey, God, seriously, that doesn't sound like that good of a plan. I mean, you're choosing controversy, ordinariness, political oppression, and you're going to rely on teenage parents. That doesn't seem like a very good plan. Why not just like, hey, have you ever read, what if you were like, hey, God, have you ever read Genesis? You can just make someone out of the clay. You'd be like, there's Jesus. mean, that would be amazing too, right? Why? Why? Mix all this stuff up, all the messiness of ordinary life and its controversies. Do you think, now, let's just say Jesus was growing up in Nazareth, and people had heard that his mother was pregnant before she was married. Do you think people would let that go? All right. And then the defense would be, it was the wind, you know? It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work that. So why? Which again is asking a different kind of question. What do these things point to? And in a simple way, I'd like to say, there's something of this story that says that whatever we mean by the divine, when I say the divine, I mean the mystery, the great mystery, is comfortable in the messiness, in ordinariness, in controversy, even in the frickin' mall, really, and all of its strangeness. And my neighbor who has 3 manger scenes, and DTE will be thanking him later, okay? So what? You would think that the world of the divine and the human are separate. You would think. In fact, that's a big part of what we would think of as early consciousness. The gods are somewhere else, up there, pulling their strings, maybe if we're lucky. And this story is saying, actually, the mystery is now mixed up with human beings and with ordinary people and ordinary teenagers. And that's the good news. That's a very different kind of story, wouldn't you agree? And if you really push Christianity in terms of its mystical theology, it says something like this: the incarnation didn't happen, it is happening. Be in the world and of it. It's happening. That's something of the ordinary mystery. Have you ever been there at the birth of a child? At that perilous entrance from darkness to light, where anything is possible, and it's scary? I mean, this, wouldn't you say, I don't know how religious you are, and I'll come back to that thought, but isn't something of a kind of mystery entering the world? Who is this being? Where did they come from? The Wikipedia entry that explains where this thing came from doesn't cut it, really. You don't say, well, actually, then you get into biology. That's one way of talking about the story. And then, being around children and watching them grow up regularly, you think, who is this human being? Where did they come from? What are they talking about? That's what I'm saying. I think the mystery of the incarnation, you push it that far, which is something of the divine enters the world every time new life comes in. Every time. The miracle of new possibility. Where is divinity, in other words, the story is saying? Everywhere. Like David White says, everything is waiting for you. Everything is waiting for you. Everything is waiting for you. The mystery is everywhere. I think that's part of the mystery of this story. And it's actually not that pretty of a story, which is why I like the messiness of it. I mean, again, God comes to you and says, not only are teenage kids going to raise this child, but he's going to be born in an era without antibiotics. One fever. That's how fragile life is. And the divine is comfortable there. That's what the story is saying. The divine is comfortable there with fevers and colds and fleeing a political dictator and crossing borders and finding refuge in another country. That's the story. It says, yeah, that's my big plan. I don't know. So there's something about this time of year that I think that echo comes down through the canyon walls. What is really happening here? The other thing I might want to mention just has to do with these gifts, because I've been thinking about this kind of thing for a while. And I was thinking about these gifts that the wise men bring. And first of all, another good idea, hey, the way we're going to sort of announce this is I'm going to use like horoscope readers, and they're going to come from the Far East, and they're going to say, we saw this star, and that's supposed to prove something. Yeah, it's a bit of an odd story. Anyway, the wise men come and they bring two kinds of gifts. They bring gold, and they bring frankincense and myrrh, which I'm kind of blending together. And there's something very powerful about these gifts. And again, my question is, on the symbolic level, what do they seem to represent? And I think in a very straightforward sense, the gold represents a kind of kingship. It represents royalty. And that's what kings have and queens have. It's a kind of royal image, which is strange because he's not the king, right? He's not. Yet he's like a kid. And they don't know what's going to happen. In fact, they leave and they go back home. They're like, hey, enjoy the gold. And away they go. They have no idea what's going to happen. The other, frankincense and myrrh, are objects of death. They're what's used in embalming. Okay? Don't believe me? Read the end of the Gospel of John. There they are again. All right? And why would you show up? Let's say your friend had a baby. You said, you know what? I give you this gold, and your child's going to die, and I give you this frankincense and myrrh. That's pretty wildly, this is kind of Irish darkness, okay? It's funny and dark and kind of beautiful. The wise men, or wise people, and it doesn't say how many, by the way, they show up and they seem to be saying, this person is a kind of king, and they're going to die. And the question is, really, are they going to live into their own royalty before they die or not? Isn't that true of every single birth of every single child? Don't they have possibility? Yes? Might they not live into it? Yes. That's called teenage years. Or 30. Do you feel that the possibility and the tension of these things? I know we've just taken it as like, oh, they must just really like Jesus, and they're like showering him with gifts, and by the way, bring your gifts to church and we'll take an offering, like we're sort of, I don't know what exactly how we try to make sense of this. These are richly symbolic. It's saying something like, the divine seems to enter the world in the most ordinary and unusual ways, whatever we mean by the divine. And the birth of every single child is kind of the birth of God once again coming into the world. Yet the world is such that we have the possibility of gold, of kingship and queenship hanging out there. Will you live into the fullness of who you are? And we have a time limit on that. It's called when they wrap us up in cloth. Same is true of the story of Jesus. After all, what was he doing for 30 years? Living at home with mom and dad. Really? Like, if you've ever had a 30-year-old in your house, you know what Mary was feeling, like, hey, you thought about like branching out a bit? Have you sent in a few applications, Jesus? I mean, seriously. And then suddenly something breaks or cracks in his life, and he starts following this wild man from the wilderness who was screaming and yelling at people down by the river. And then he wanders around in the wilderness, not eating any food, and he comes back out and says, okay, now I'm going to live my life. And the possibility of whatever he was meant to inhabit seems to, he seems to try to live into it just before he dies. So, what do you conclude? What is this holiday season really about? What is moving in the air? Where is the seeds, or what do the Kabbalists say, the sparks of the divine? Where are they? Where are they hidden in the ordinariness? I love this poem by David White because it's a poem that's sucking us back down to earth. And I think what he's calling for is the line in the middle here, what he calls alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. Are you over-familiarized with all things Christmas? Yes, I would think so. You had that sweater last year or 10 years ago, all right? We're overly familiar with all this stuff, and he's just saying, inviting us into a kind of alertness. What if we could walk through the next week saying, what is hidden in plain sight? That's an incarnational kind of question. What is hidden in plain sight? What possibilities are about to burst forth on the scene that I don't quite see yet? What pregnant possibilities are here at the family dinner table? And I just had family Christmas. There were a lot of pregnant possibilities at the table, all right? A lot of, how shall I put it? It was certainly, you could feel the tension of things. And I remember this, well, I didn't remember, I'm remembering it now. Alertness is a hidden discipline of familiarity. I've been here before, I've sat with these people before, I've heard this stuff before, and we shut it down. Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. I think there's something about this time of year, I think David White is calling us back into the ordinary. What if we lived with the kind of mystery? Like I saw some kids waiting in line to sit with Santa, and they're so excited. Like, what good would I do if I leaned over the railing and was like, hey guys, Santa's not real. You have to understand that's a story. And in fact, it's just manipulating your parents to buy you things. And that man up there, he lives in Lowell. And, he has to grow that beard out all year, poor guy, probably smells, That's not, do you see what I'm saying? Literalism? You don't go in for that with children. The pregnant possibility of the magic of things. We need more of that. Especially the time of year when things are the most dark. Put down the weight of your aloneness and ease into the conversation. Put down the weight of your aloneness and ease into the conversation. The kettle is singing even as it pours you a drink. The kettle is singing. The cooking pots have left their arrogant aloofness and seen the good in you at last. That'd be nice. All the birds and creatures of the world are unutterably themselves. Everything is waiting for you. Thanks for listening.